Judith McNamara. If you don't know Judith, you should know because she's the head of the school. So, and she's going to talk about the impact of RCEP on higher education in the Asia Pacific region. So let's see. That's a very interesting topic, and not many people talk about this issue. So hopefully we'll all learn. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Matthew, for organising the symposium. I really enjoyed this morning understanding a little bit more about RCEP, including how to pronounce it. So I'm hoping we can have a good discussion about the impacts or the potential impacts of the agreement on higher education. Okay, so I'll be talking a little bit about the importance of international higher education, some of the barriers to trade in global higher education, and then some of the issues that arise or potentially arise out of RCEP and other trade agreements. So in Australia, international education is a valuable sector in the Australian economy. In 2015 to 16, education exports were worth over $20 billion, and higher education was the largest sector, valued at nearly $14 billion. That valuation of education exports includes education-related travel expenditure. So when international students come to Australia and spend money, that's counted as education exports. So the largest sources of education exports were China, India and Vietnam. And in 2015 to 16, education-related travel services was the largest sector in terms of service exports, and education is the third largest export sector overall. And within that, the Asia-Pacific region is critical to education exports in Australia. So the RCEP countries represent 7 of the top 10 countries for Australian education services exports. The potential opportunities for Australia flowing from free trade and liberalisation of higher education in the region are significant. But it's not just in Australia that higher education and internationalisation of higher education is important. A number of countries in the region seek to establish themselves as hubs of higher education. And that's for a variety of reasons. I mean, chiefly, higher education is seen as a vital plank in economic development in countries, but also in many countries in the region, there's a narrowing of the population with people under 25. So that means that existing higher education the existing higher education sector will need to shrink unless those countries can attract students from overseas. So that's particularly in the case in places like Japan and China, where there's a contraction in the under 25 population. So there are a couple of ways in which the RCEP might impact on higher education. So firstly, education itself is a service, a sector that's covered by the negotiations. And secondly is that the services chapter provides that countries will encourage professional bodies to recognise qualifications in relevant regulated service sectors. So international higher education takes a range of different forms, so we can align that to the different modes of supply under the General Agreement on Trade and Services framework. The 4 modes are cross-border supply, which is generally distance or online education. Mode 2 is consumption abroad, so that's international students studying locally on campuses. Mode 3 is commercial presence, which is mostly offshore campuses established overseas. And fourthly, mobility of persons, so academics working overseas or on exchange. So the most important and valuable mode of supply in higher education is consumption abroad, which, as I said, involves international students studying on campus. This is most of the dollar value associated with international higher education, particularly given the dollar value of the education-related travel expenses. There's been substantial growth in international students in higher education in recent decades. And not only have there been increasing numbers of students studying abroad, but the destination countries have become more diverse. So there's less of a focus on studying in North America and greater mobility of students into Europe and in Asia. Generally, student mobility is from non-OECD countries to OECD countries, and about half the total number of international students come from Asian countries. So given that growth in international students, the liberalisation of trade in cross-border higher education could be significant to economies in the Asian region. I just want to spend a little bit of time unpacking some of those different modes of supply. So I'll start with, I'll start with the second mode of service, which is international students. So this, as I said, involves international students studying on campus, and that's, sorry, I'm repeating myself. So the mode one mode of service is the second one I want to talk about because that's the second most important. So that's essentially distance education. So students studying online, it would include MOOCs, it would include external offerings, so whether that, and it includes joint programs and programs delivered by overseas institutions through local partners. Distance education, including online learning and MOOCs, enables universities to offer courses overseas without having to have any physical presence in the country. So that means that they can facilitate the offering of courses and interaction with students, but they don't need to provide anything back into that local economy in terms of developing the higher education institutions in the domestic situation. So there's no direct investment in local economies, there's no community outreach or any of the research that usually goes with having a university presence. The cross-border supply can also include joint offerings and the sale of programs to another institution. So an institution might partner with an institution in another country to deliver a qualification using course materials provided by them. So, for example, in Malaysia, we have a relationship with a college called SEGI. They're not accredited to provide degree qualifications in Malaysia, but they partner with overseas institutions in two different ways. So students might start their study with SEGI in a diploma, and then they articulate into a degree program either in Australia or the United Kingdom. So that's generally called a twinning arrangement. The benefit for the student is that they get to spend some time studying in Malaysia where the costs are lower and they don't have to leave their family, but they end up having an international experience for a shorter period of time and they receive an overseas qualification. The other type of arrangement is where the overseas university delivers their entire program externally, but that program is taught locally by the local institution through their academics. Again, benefits for the students in that they don't have the costs of travel, but they receive the overseas qualification. So in the Asia-Pacific region, Singapore, Malaysia and Hong Kong are the main importers of cross-border education through this type of program mobility. But China is also increasingly involved in joint programs. That type of supply of education has benefit to the local country because it enables them to develop the quality of their own education services and to move themselves into the export market via the inward movement of foreign students. So at the moment, that type of cross-border supply of education services is fairly limited, but given the growth of the internet and other technologies, the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, it's likely that that sector will grow and become more important. The third mode of service is commercial presence. So in the higher education context, universities often establish offshore campuses. They might build a campus overseas, or they might take over an existing campus. These types of arrangements, again, often supplement distance learning. So you might start your qualification at home through the offshore campus, but then move to Australia to complete the degree. And again, it has the attraction of reducing the costs to the students of that study. The fourth mode of supply is staff mobility. Staff mobility has a long tradition in higher education. It's a means of facilitating research and international exchange. So academics might go overseas for professional development, or they might be employed by a foreign university to teach, or they might work for their own campus offshore in an offshore campus. Like student mobility, academic mobility has been increasing around the world. So particularly in Japan and Korea, inbound mobility of academics has more than doubled in the first decade of the 21st century. Local institutions might also establish programs specifically designed to attract international students, and these are often taught by visiting academics. So Tsinghua Law School, I don't think you can actually read that, but Tsinghua Law School in Beijing offers a Masters in International Law in the summer, which is taught in English, and usually taught by visiting academics from around the world. So where universities enter into international collaboration agreements, there's often a mix of those different types of supply. So the cooperation agreement might accommodate student exchange, staff exchange. There might be international articulation agreements or the establishment of joint programs. So some of those aspects covered by the agreements might be covered by RCEP and other trade agreements, but some might not be. So they would only be covered if they were commercial arrangements. So things like staff exchanges and generally student exchanges aren't commercial arrangements, but where staff are employed overseas or students are international students studying on campus, then that's likely to be covered. The barriers to trade in education services are generally non-tariff barriers. They might be explicit regulatory barriers intended to limit international education, or they might be the consequence of regulation intended to provide for quality assurance of domestic providers and qualifications. So other than regulatory barriers, barriers might be political, social or cultural. For example, education might be seen to be exclusively the responsibility of government, so tight controls are kept over the content of curriculum, which leaves little flexibility for internationalisation. So that was the case in Korea until recently, when the government's made a decision to open up universities to international education. So it's a pretty complex system of regulation of higher education in countries across Asia, and it can be difficult to identify and unravel the various barriers to trade that exist. And there's often a mix of different types of barriers relating to different supplies of services. So I've tried to sort of categorise those into three different barriers. So looking at a lack of a shared qualifications framework, restrictions on international student mobility, and the costs of establishing an overseas presence. So given that there isn't a shared framework for recognition of qualifications, the recognition varies across different countries and is different for different professions and industries. So that might be either as a result of public policy in relation to recognition of overseas qualifications, or it might be the result of decisions taken by individual employers. So in some countries, there might not be a central accreditation procedure for recognition of qualifications from overseas universities. So for example, in Hong Kong, that's the status. It's entirely up to an individual employer, whether they choose to recognise an overseas qualification. There might also be restrictions on the ability of local institutions to give credit for overseas studies. outside the policy arena and specific professional requirements, it's essentially up to employers to decide whether they're going to recognise a qualification or not. So if it's in business and there's no specific requirement for professional recognition, then an employer can choose which qualifications to recognise, but sometimes even that's restricted. So in China, for instance, one of the largest employers is government, and government employers in China don't recognise qualifications that are obtained through online learning. So that's a significant restriction on the ability to provide programs through distance learning. Another issue in relation to qualifications is the recognition of particular qualifications for entry into the professions. And at the moment, the recognition of professional qualifications is patchy. So for instance, under the Australia-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, 8 of the Australian law schools are recognised, and the rest of the law schools aren't, even though there's no basis in terms of Australia's qualification framework or professional requirements for that distinction. That lack of a uniform framework for recognition of qualifications also presents a regulatory burden on institutions who are seeking to establish themselves overseas, as it means they'll have to navigate different quality assurance regimes in each country in which they operate. In terms of restrictions on international students, these might apply to foreign students studying locally, or they might apply to local students going overseas. In terms of local students going overseas to study, there might be quotas, so restrictions on the number of students who can go overseas, or there might be limitations on the ability for cross-border payments to facilitate overseas study. Another way that is often used to restrict students going overseas is to restrict local advertisement and recruitment by overseas universities. And sometimes that means universities recruit students through local agents. In terms of restrictions on foreign students studying locally, these might be visa rules which restrict the right of foreign students to work. There could be quotas, numerical limits on the number of foreign students studying locally. There could be discriminatory enrolment criteria or a limit in the types of courses in which students can enrol. And there might be restrictions on overseas students or international students from gaining access to subsidies for tuition fees or things like transport. So as well as those regulatory restrictions, there's also financial and social burdens for students studying abroad. There's a social cost in terms of leaving family and friends and potential for isolation. There's also potential delay in progress of studies if language barriers are an issue. And there's also the financial cost involved in living overseas. For institutions, the cost of establishing a presence overseas can be significant. So in some countries, for a university to operate locally, there's a requirement to establish a local entity. Sometimes that means there has to be a physical presence, or there might be a requirement to enter into a joint venture with a local institution. And that's the case in China, where the expectation is that foreign providers need to operate in joint venture arrangements with local providers, but the foreign providers can have majority ownership in those ventures. Other countries prevent institutions from opening branch campuses at all. So where there is the ability to establish a physical presence, the cost of setting up such a presence is high. Infrastructure costs in building a campus are large. But as well as that, it can take a long period of time to establish a reputation and to gain sufficient enrolments to offset the costs. There could also be uncertainty about the risks of establishing an offshore campus. So will the local students have the academic preparedness to succeed in courses? What will be the regulatory risks in that presence? And those can be extreme. So I had on one of the earlier slides a picture of a news article from 2007 when the University of New South Wales fairly spectacularly closed its branch campus in Singapore after just one semester of operation and after investing about $17 million in the venture. And those sorts of risks are significant for countries in seeking to establish that offshore campus. There might be other regulations that need to be complied with. So, for instance, in East Malaysia, there's a requirement for institutions to be operated by a local resident. There might be restrictions on visa arrangements for teachers. There might be special permits that are needed. There might be limitations around the use of the word university. There can also be restrictions on how qualifications. So when a university establishes an offshore campus, they'll usually be seen as a private institution in that country, regardless of their status in Australia. And then as a private institution, the regulation that applies to them might be different from the regulation that applies to public institutions. And in both Malaysia and India, the regulation of public and private higher education is different and quite complex. So just as a small example, in Malaysia, students who study at private universities, who study law at private universities after they finish their degree, need to complete a certificate in legal practice, which is a little similar to our practical legal training, only I understand it's more arduous and difficult to pass, whereas students who study at the local public university don't need to complete that requirement as well. I forgot to point out that's a photograph of a street in Malaysia called Subang Jaya, and that's a place where the street is littered with international agents, recruitment agents, with university placement officers, and with some university campuses. And so those international agents, they work on behalf of Australian universities and universities from around the world to recruit students, because overseas universities aren't allowed to recruit directly, which means that we're reliant on other people to identify students to come to university. Now, in some institutions, there's still a rigorous process in terms of admission to the university in Australia, but you might be familiar with the 730 report last year, where in some institutions that was causing issues because of the practices of those agents who don't actually work for the universities. Okay, so there are opportunities flowing for our higher education flowing from free trade agreement that are pretty significant. So generally, internationalisation of higher education is seen as desirable. It stimulates academic and cultural exchange. It allows for greater mobility of people, and it provides opportunities for economic development. The potential for harmonisation of qualifications across the region could enable an integrated higher education area to be established in Asia, similar to that in Europe, which again would create further opportunities for international student mobility. But that's more likely to benefit developed countries like Australia, New Zealand and Singapore, who have established higher education institutions. The removal of some of those restrictions on the recognition of qualifications would again allow greater mobility in the movement of people, but also provide opportunities for people from developing countries to study abroad and to receive a qualification that would then be recognised at home. But there are some potential issues that could arise out of RCEP and other free trade agreements. So particularly with RCEP, there's a great disparity in the levels of economic development and the development of higher education in the Asian countries. So it's likely that not all countries would benefit equally from the liberalisation of cross-border higher education. Another issue is consumer protection. So if liberalisation occurs without a common framework for qualifications to be recognised. Then, given the vast differences in the way that higher regulation is regulated, how would that quality of education be assured across the region? So there is a concern that liberalisation of international higher education could result in a decline in quality. Some of the regulation that creates barriers to trade in higher education is aimed at domestic regulation and quality assurance. So it's not clear how that regulation, whether that would survive RCEP or whether it would be impinged upon. There are also issues around the cultural dimensions of higher education, which I think are fairly complex. But in most countries, education is seen as a public good, and in many, the role of government to control the curriculum is seen as important. So in Malaysia, for instance, all university courses need to include local Malaysian content. So if courses are being provided by offshore providers who aren't subject to those requirements, then that can have cultural impacts in those countries. There's also social costs in terms of online delivery, which I referred to before. So if there's no commercial presence and there's no investment in the country, then there isn't the opportunity for those countries to benefit from the impact of having a university locally, but there's also no opportunity for those universities to develop their own skills so that they're in a position to supply education, higher education themselves. So if the overseas institutions pull out, you could be left with students not being able to complete courses, but you could also be left with no domestic higher education to contribute to economic development in those countries. All right, I've run out of time. So a suggestion has been made by Vincent Lancren of a framework to try and address some of those issues that could be adopted before any sort of liberalisation of cross-border education has been suggested. And that involves adopting the OECD guidelines for cross-border higher education. The issue there is that while those guidelines are fairly well met in OECD countries, they're generally not met in non-OECD countries. So there would be a little bit of work that would need to happen to put those guidelines in place.